Harlem in the late 1930s did not sleep the way other neighborhoods slept. It rested with one eye open. It dreamed carefully. It learned early that hope must be guarded, dignity must be protected, and silence could be either surrender or strategy. On Lenox Avenue, beneath the dim halo of amber street lamps, men in tailored suits and polished shoes gathered outside jazz clubs that carried the scent of brass instruments and expensive cologne. Women with silk scarves and steady posture walked arm in arm, their laughter soft but deliberate. Harlem was more than streets and storefronts. It was pride stitched into every brick. It was survival dressed in elegance. And in the center of that careful balance stood a man the neighborhood had begun to understand without ever fully explaining. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson did not walk loudly. He did not announce himself. Yet when he entered a room, conversations did not stop, they softened. Eyes did not widen, they adjusted. His presence was not built on spectacle. It was built on composure. He was not the tallest man in Harlem, not the most physically imposing. But there was something about the way he listened deeply, without interruption, that unsettled the careless and steadied the uncertain. He had learned young that words, once spoken, could not be retrieved. So he chose them carefully. By 1938, Harlem had changed. Opportunity shimmered just beyond reach. Black-owned businesses were rising. Musicians were crossing into national radio. Teachers, lawyers, barbers, shopkeepers, all building something that felt dangerously close to stability. But power does not watch growth comfortably. Downtown investors had begun tightening leases. Insurance policies mysteriously lapsed. Loans were denied without explanation. And in the quiet corners of city offices, signatures moved like knives through paper. The incident that began this story did not start with shouting. It started with paperwork. On a Tuesday morning, a letter arrived at St. Nicholas Community School, a modest brick building that stood as a symbol of upward movement for Harlem's children. The school had been founded by local families pooling savings together, determined to provide education that went beyond survival. It was not wealthy. It was not grand. But it was theirs. The letter informed the board that the building's mortgage had been restructured. Ownership had been transferred through a holding company few recognized. The new terms required immediate back payment sums, impossible to meet within 30 days. If unpaid, eviction proceedings would begin. The children knew none of this. They continued reciting multiplication tables. They practiced penmanship. They raised their hands eagerly when called upon. They did not yet understand that the ground beneath their desks was being negotiated away, but the adults understood. And within hours, the news reached Bumpy. He did not react immediately. He sat at a small table in the back office of a jazz lounge. He partially oversaw, more guardian than owner, and read the letter twice. His expression did not change. He folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. Across town, the holding company traced back to interests aligned with powerful downtown financiers, men who preferred Harlem profitable but not independent. Investors who believed property ownership translated to behavioral control. The school was not just a building. It was a statement. And statements, if left unanswered, spread. That evening, the school board gathered in quiet distress. Teachers clutched ledgers. Parents whispered about fundraising drives that would never raise enough in time. The principal, a dignified woman in her early 40s named Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, maintained composure with visible effort. "We will find a solution," she said. Though her hands trembled slightly against the desk. Someone suggested asking Bumpy for help. The room fell still. They did not see him as a criminal caricature whispered about in newspapers. They saw him as a stabilizing force. A man who understood power, not the kind printed in headlines, but the kind that moved silently through rooms where decisions were made. A messenger was sent. When Bumpy arrived, he did not sit at the head of the table. He chose a chair near the window. He asked no dramatic questions. He listened. Mrs. Hayes handed him the letter. He read it once. "Who signed this?" he asked quietly. "A representative named Charles Whitmore," she replied. "But the holding company appears new." Bumpy nodded slowly. Whitmore was not new to him. Whitmore had ambitions. Ambition without conscience was predictable. "Has anyone spoken to him directly?" Bumpy asked. "We requested a meeting," he declined. Bumpy stood. "I'll speak with him." There was no bravado in his voice. No promise of confrontation. Just certainty. Outside, Harlem hummed as usual, unaware that its future was being tallied in an office downtown. The next morning, Bumpy dressed in a charcoal suit, polished his shoes until they reflected the window light, and walked south. He did not bring an entourage. He did not announce his arrival. At Whitmore Holdings, the receptionist hesitated when he gave his name. But Whitmore, curious and slightly amused, agreed to the meeting. Whitmore's office overlooked the city like a throne room overlooking territory. He was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, confident in the way men are when insulated by contracts and connections. "Mr. Johnson," Whitmore greeted with thin politeness. "What brings you downtown?" Bumpy did not sit until invited. "The school on St. Nicholas," he said calmly. "You've adjusted its mortgage," Whitmore smiled faintly. "Business adjustment. Nothing personal." Bumpy's gaze did not waver. "It is personal," he replied evenly. "Children attend that school." Whitmore leaned back. "Children do not pay mortgages." Silence followed. Bumpy did not rush to fill it. "Harlem has been improving." Whitmore continued. "Property values rise. Investors expect returns. Sentiment cannot interfere." "And stability?" Bumpy asked quietly. Whitmore's brow shifted. "Excuse me?" "Instability spreads faster than sentiment," Bumpy said. "You remove the school. You unsettle families. You unsettle families. You unsettle commerce." Whitmore studied him. "Are you threatening economic disruption, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy's voice remained level. "I am observing consequence." Whitmore chuckled lightly. "The terms stand." The meeting ended without resolution. But something in Whitmore's composure had shifted. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. Back in Harlem, rumors swirled. Some called for protests. Others whispered darker suggestions. Anger rose like summer heat pressing against patience. But Bumpy did not call for retaliation. He called for information. He began tracing the holding company's structure, not through intimidation, but through relationships. Clerks who owed favors. Accountants who disliked Whitmore's arrogance. Real estate brokers who valued long-term stability over short-term gain. Within days, a clearer picture formed. Whitmore's expansion was over-leveraged. Several properties under his portfolio were dependent on Harlem's rent consistency. If Harlem faltered, even slightly, his financial projections would suffer. Bumpy understood something fundamental. Power often disguises vulnerability beneath paperwork. He did not expose Whitmore publicly. He waited. Meanwhile, eviction notices were posted on the school doors. Children asked questions. Parents clenched jaws. Mrs. Hayes gathered the students in the assembly hall and told them only this: "We are stronger together." That night, Harlem did not sleep easily. Bumpy walked the streets alone, hat low against the breeze. He stopped outside the school and looked at the brick walls as if measuring time itself. A young boy approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Johnson, is our school going away?" Bumpy knelt slightly to meet his eyes. "Not if we stand steady," he replied. The boy nodded, reassured not by explanation, but by tone. By the end of the week, something unusual began happening. Several tenants across Whitmore's Harlem properties delayed rent payments, not in rebellion, but in coordinated caution. Shopkeepers paused expansion contracts. Suppliers reconsidered agreements. No threats were issued. No vandalism occurred. Just hesitation. Whitmore noticed, and phone calls increased. Account managers requested reassurance. Investors asked about localized instability. Whitmore scheduled another meeting. This time, he invited Bumpy. When Bumpy entered the office again, Whitmore did not smile. "You've created disruption." Whitmore said evenly. "I've created reflection," Bumpy corrected. Whitmore leaned forward. "You understand that if this escalates, law enforcement becomes involved." Bumpy's expression did not shift. Law enforcement becomes involved when laws are broken. Silence. Whitmore's fingers tapped the desk. "What do you want?" he asked finally. Bumpy placed a folder gently on the desk. Inside were financial summaries, accurate, precise. "You are overextended," Bumpy said quietly. "Harlem stabilizes your margins. Destabilize Harlem, and the numbers shift." Whitmore stared at the documents. "I'm offering stability," Bumpy continued. "Reinstate the school's original mortgage terms. Publicly, quietly, we continue. Business as usual. And if I refuse?" Bumpy's voice softened, not threatening, but immovable. "Then instability continues." The room felt smaller. Whitmore understood. This was not a gang confrontation, that it was negotiation. 3 days later, an official notice arrived at St. Nicholas Community School. The mortgage restructuring had been administratively corrected. Original terms reinstated. Eviction withdrawn. No explanation given. No public apology. Just reversal. When the announcement was read aloud in the assembly hall, teachers closed their eyes in relief. Parents wept quietly. Children cheered without. Fully understanding the magnitude of what had nearly been lost, Harlem exhaled. That evening, as jazz drifted once again through open club doors, Bumpy sat on the stoop outside the school, hat resting on his knee. Mrs. Hayes approached. "You didn't threaten him," she said softly. "No," Bumpy replied. "You didn't bribe him." "No, you simply showed him consequence." Bumpy looked at the lit windows where children cleaned chalkboards. "Power without violence lasts longer," he said quietly. Across the city, Whitmore stared at financial reports. Unsettled not by loss, but by realization that Harlem was not as dependent as he believed, and Bumpy Johnson was not a man to underestimate, but deeper currents had begun moving beneath the surface because Whitmore was not the only man watching. And in downtown offices where pride wounded easily, some men do not accept correction gracefully. Victory in Harlem did not arrive with parades. It arrived quietly, like a man closing a door without slamming it. The school stood. The children returned to lessons. The eviction notices were gone. But those who understood power knew something critical men like Charles Whitmore did not. Forget embarrassment. They archived it. In pride, when bruised in private offices overlooking Manhattan, as a way of returning with calculation. For 2 weeks after the mortgage reversal, nothing appeared different. Jazz continued to float through open windows. Couples strolled Lenox Avenue as though the city belonged to them. Shopkeepers reopened credit tabs. The school bell rang each morning with renewed confidence. But Bumpy Johnson felt it. Not fear. Shift. He sensed it in the way downtown papers began publishing editorials about rising instability in northern neighborhoods. He noticed city inspectors making unexpected visits to Harlem storefronts. Fire code violations appeared on buildings that had stood untouched for years. Liquor licenses were reviewed. Permits delayed. Inspections failed for reasons no one could clearly explain. It was not direct retaliation. It was pressure. And pressure, when applied slowly, can suffocate without leaving fingerprints. One evening, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes visited Bumpy again. Her composure was intact, but fatigue had found its way into her eyes. "They're auditing the school," she said quietly. "Curriculum compliance, funding transparency. They've frozen our supply accounts pending review." Bumpy listened. "They say it's routine," she added, "but it isn't." No, it wasn't. Whitmore had learned something from their last meeting. He would not engage directly again. He would not allow himself to appear threatened. Instead, he would use the system, the polite machinery of bureaucracy, to grind Harlem down in increments. Too small to spark public outrage, Bumpy stood slowly from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the street. Children were playing stickball under the amber glow of evening lamps. "Has the school violated any codes?" he asked. "No." "Then they will find nothing. But in the meantime—" "They stall us," she replied softly. "They make us look unstable." Bumpy turned. "Then we remove instability." The next morning, instead of visiting Whitmore, Bumpy did something unexpected. He began meeting with Harlem's ministers. Churches were the backbone of the neighborhood, not politically loud, but morally firm. Pastors commanded respect not through fear, but through trust. If pressure was being applied through the city, then response would come through unity. Over the next several days, quiet meetings took place in church basements and back offices. Shopkeepers attended, schoolteachers, barbers, mothers, accountants. No anger was stirred, no calls for defiance were issued. Instead, Bumpy asked one simple question: what does Harlem stand for? The answers varied but shared one theme: dignity. If dignity is attacked, Bumpy said evenly, we respond with clarity. He began organizing something subtle yet powerful: documentation. Not every business in Harlem began reviewing its licenses, taxes, and inspections meticulously. Compliance was tightened to perfection. Records were polished. Every receipt accounted for. Every permit displayed visibly. If the city wished to scrutinize Harlem, Harlem would give them nothing to find. Meanwhile, something else began quietly unfolding. Downtown banks began noticing unusual patterns. Harlem businesses, many of which Whitmore's investors depended upon, were refinancing through alternative lenders. Cooperative credit unions formed. Small but strategic financial shifts began insulating Harlem from downtown leverage. Whitmore received reports. Johnson is consolidating. One associate warned. Whitmore remained composed, but irritation crept into his posture. He is organizing, Whitmore corrected. That is not illegal. No, the associate admitted. But it reduces our exposure leverage. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline. His mistake had not been the mortgage restructuring. His mistake had been underestimating the response. Still, pride is stubborn. If he could not destabilize the school financially, he would destabilize reputation. A rumor surfaced in a city newspaper, suggesting criminal influence over Harlem educational institutions. The article was carefully worded, not accusatory, but insinuating. It mentioned unnamed community power brokers interfering with legitimate business practice. Harlem read between the lines. Bumpy read it twice. He did not storm into the newspaper office. He did not issue threats. Instead, he visited someone he had not seen in months, a man named Franklin Cole, an editor known for valuing credibility over convenience. Cole had once been fair to Harlem when others were not. When Bumpy arrived at his modest newsroom office, Cole studied him cautiously. "I assume you've seen the article," Cole said. "I have," Bumpy replied calmly. "You want a retraction?" "No." Cole blinked, surprised. "I want balance." Cole leaned forward. "You believe the piece is unbalanced?" "I believe it is incomplete." There was no aggression in his tone. "Then give me something complete," Cole said slowly. Bumpy placed a folder on the desk. Inside were school compliance records, financial statements, documentation of the mortgage reversal, no embellishment, no threats. "Print facts," Bumpy said evenly. "Nothing more." Cole studied him. "You understand," he said cautiously, "that printing this implies conflict with certain investors." Bumpy's gaze was steady. Truth does not pick sides. 3 days later, a follow-up article appeared, not defensive, not accusatory, simply factual. It highlighted the school's compliance record. It acknowledged the mortgage correction as administrative oversight. It quoted Mrs. Hayes' statement about community cooperation. Whitmore read the article at breakfast. His jaw tightened, because now the narrative had shifted. This was no longer a neighborhood resisting pressure. This was a community demonstrating competence. And competence is harder to dismiss. But the turning point had not yet arrived, because what Whitmore had failed to consider was that some of his own investors valued stability more than ego. One of those investors, an older man named Harold Beaumont, requested a private meeting with Bumpy. Beaumont was not flamboyant. He was not ruthless. He was cautious. And caution often hides intelligence. They met not downtown, but in a neutral restaurant halfway between territories. Beaumont studied Bumpy with quiet curiosity. "You're young," he said finally. "You're experienced," Bumpy replied calmly. A faint smile crossed Beaumont's face. "You disrupted projections," Beaumont continued. "Investors dislike unpredictability." "Instability is unpredictable," Bumpy answered. Beaumont folded his hands. "You could have escalated," he sighed. "You didn't. Escalation damages both sides." Silence settled between them. "What do you want?" Beaumont asked finally. Bumpy did not hesitate. Respect for Harlem's institutions. No more pressure campaigns. No more narrative manipulation. Beaumont nodded slowly, and in return, stability. Beaumont understood the language. This was not a demand for dominance. It was a demand for equilibrium. Within a week, several downtown investors quietly withdrew from Whitmore's more aggressive strategies. City inspections decreased. Newspaper insinuations ceased. Bureaucratic delays dissolved. Whitmore, cornered not by violence but by financial isolation, realized something profound. Bumpy had not attacked him. He had surrounded him with competence, with unity, with moral high ground. Whitmore requested one final meeting. This time, it was not in his skyscraper office. It was at St. Nicholas Community School. When Whitmore arrived, Harlem watched. Not with hostility, with stillness. Inside the assembly hall, Mrs. Hayes stood beside Bumpy. Children sat quietly in their seats, curious about the well-dressed man from downtown. Whitmore approached the podium. His pride wrestled visibly with practicality. Recent administrative misunderstandings, he began carefully, have been resolved. Our office recognizes the school's full compliance and values its role in the community. He did not apologize directly, but he acknowledged legitimacy. And in that acknowledgement, something shifted. Afterward, as parents filed out of the hall, Whitmore approached Bumpy privately. "You could have destroyed me," Whitmore said quietly. Bumpy shook his head. "Destruction is expensive," he replied. "Correction is efficient." Whitmore studied him for a long moment. "You're not what they say you are." Bumpy's expression remained neutral. "I am exactly what Harlem needs me to be." That night, as Harlem's street lamps flickered, alive once more, the neighborhood felt different, stronger, not because it had defeated an enemy, but because it had proven its own stability. Mrs. Hayes approached Bumpy outside the school. "You never raised your voice," she said softly. "Loud men rarely last," he replied. She looked at the children laughing across the courtyard. "You gave them more than a building," she said. "You gave them proof." Bumpy watched the sky darken above the rooftops. Proof lasts longer than fear. But somewhere in the distance, beyond the visible conflict, another set of eyes had been observing, not Whitmore's, not Beaumont's. Someone else had taken note of the way Bumpy moved power without spectacle. And that someone would not be interested in negotiation. Harlem had learned something new in recent months. It had learned that unity could be sharper than outrage, that dignity could destabilize arrogance, and that power did not always arrive with raised voices. But power, when exercised quietly, attracts a different kind of attention. It attracts Men who do not want negotiation. The change began subtly. Like a draft creeping through a closed window, two unfamiliar cars appeared on Lenox Avenue over consecutive evenings. Parked too long, engines idling. A liquor distributor suddenly canceled shipments to 3 Harlem establishments without explanation. A bank loan previously approved for a neighborhood grocery store was reconsidered. No direct accusations were made. No open threats delivered. But pressure returned, this time colder, less bureaucratic, more personal. Bumpy noticed. He always did. He was seated in the back of a dimly lit jazz lounge one night when the club's owner, Samuel "Sammy" Raines, approached with attention. He struggled to mask. "They're asking questions about you," Sammy said quietly, wiping his hands against a towel, though they were not wet. "Men from downtown, not Whitmer's type, different." Bumpy looked up slowly. "What kind of questions?" "About loyalty. About control. About whether Harlem answers to you." Bumpy's expression remained unreadable. "And what did you tell them?" "That Harlem answers to itself," Sammy replied firmly. A faint nod from Bumpy. Outside, a saxophone wailed softly, its melody heavy with something unspoken. The man behind the new pressure was named Vincent Callahan. Callahan did not operate through banks or mortgage notes. He operated through intimidation cloaked in civility. He had interests in shipping, freight, and distribution contracts throughout the boroughs. Where Whitmore relied on paperwork, Callahan relied on leverage, and Callahan did not appreciate variables. He had watched the Whitmore episode with quiet calculation. He had seen a young man in Harlem maneuver established investors into retreat without firing a shot. That kind of influence unsettled men who built their empires on fear. Callahan believed power must be visible. Bumpy's was not. That made it dangerous. The first direct contact came not to Bumpy, but to Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. A representative from a regional educational review board requested immediate reevaluation of the school's accreditation status. Unlike previous inspections, this one was aggressive. Inspectors disrupted classes, questioned teachers harshly, demanded documentation already submitted twice. Mrs. Hayes stood firm, but strain began showing in her posture. That evening, she visited Bumpy again, this time not composed but weary. "They're not looking for compliance," she said. "They're looking to exhaust us." Bumpy listened. "They've reduced our supplier credit lines, chalk, books, even heating fuel." He rose slowly from his chair. "Who is leading the review?" "A man named Donovan. He answers to a regional office tied to distribution contracts." Distribution.freight.shipping. Callahan. The connection was clear. But this was not a direct attack on property. It was an attack on morale. If the school faltered from exhaustion rather than eviction, the narrative would be different. Harlem would appear incapable of sustaining its own institutions. Callahan understood perception. So did Bumpy. That night, instead of visiting an office or drafting a strategy on paper, Bumpy did something unexpected. He visited every parent of every child enrolled at St. Nicholas. Not to incite anger. To speak plainly. He stood in kitchens, on stoops, in narrow hallways where wallpaper peeled from old walls. He explained the pressure calmly. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He asked for patience and participation. "What are you asking us to do?" One father asked. "Show up," Bumpy replied. The next morning, when inspectors returned to the school, they were met with something unusual. Parents, dozens of them, standing outside, quietly, not shouting, not protesting. Simply present. Inside, classrooms were full not of disruption, but of attention. Children raised hands. Teachers taught with composed intensity. Every ledger was organized. Every compliance sheet tabbed and labeled. Inspectors found nothing, but pressure did not cease. That evening, Sammy Raines' jazz lounge was visited by 2 well-dressed men who introduced themselves as logistics consultants. They informed Sammy that future liquor deliveries might face delays due to routing complications. Sammy reported the conversation to Bumpy. Callahan was escalating, not publicly, but economically. A supply chokehold, and Harlem's businesses were interwoven. If one faltered, others felt strain. Bumpy understood something critical. Callahan's strategy depended on isolation. Pick off suppliers, fracture coordination, make Harlem doubt its own sustainability. So Bumpy reversed the equation. Instead of defending against pressure, he expanded outward. He began building connections beyond Callahan's distribution web. Brooklyn suppliers, Queens cooperatives, even small upstate freight operators who resented Callahan's dominance. Meetings occurred quietly in train stations, diners, warehouses. No contracts signed at first, just conversations. Callahan heard whispers. Johnson is diversifying. An associate warned. Callahan frowned. Diversifying what? Distribution routes. Callahan leaned back, irritated. He thinks he can bypass me. He's trying. Callahan's mistake was assuming Harlem was too small to network outward. But Harlem had always been a crossroads of migration, music, and movement. Its connections stretched further than downtown executives realized. Still, Callahan was not a man who retreated easily. 3 nights later, something happened that threatened to shatter everything. A small fire broke out behind St. Nicholas Community School, contained quickly, damage minimal, but intentional. The message was no longer subtle. When Bumpy arrived at the scene, smoke still curled faintly into the night sky. Firefighters packed hoses. Children watched from a distance, frightened. Mrs. Hayes stood near the entrance, hands clasped tightly. "They're escalating," she whispered. Bumpy examined the brickwork quietly. He did not speak. Immediately. Because escalation demanded a decision. Retaliation would be expected. Callahan likely anticipated anger. That night Harlem waited. Would Bumpy respond with confrontation? Would streets ignite? Would this become the kind of conflict newspapers devoured? Instead, Bumpy did something that stunned even his closest allies. The following morning, he requested a meeting, not with Callahan privately but publicly. He invited local business leaders, ministers, teachers, and yes, even press representatives. Meeting would occur in the school assembly hall. Callahan was invited formally. Many assumed he would decline. He did not. Callahan arrived precisely at noon, flanked by 2 associates. His demeanor was composed, almost amused. He expected accusation. The hall was full. Parents sat beside shopkeepers, ministers beside journalists, children in the back rows, quiet and watchful. Bumpy stood at the front. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He began by thanking the firefighters. He thanked the teachers. He thanked the parents for standing firm. Then he addressed Callahan directly, not with hostility, but with clarity. "Mr. Callahan," he said evenly, "you and I both understand leverage. You understand distribution. I understand stability. But we are not enemies unless we choose to be." Callahan's jaw tightened slightly. Bumpy continued, "This school is not a contract. It is not a profit margin. It is not a bargaining chip. It is children." Silence gripped the room. "If there are grievances," Bumpy said, "we discuss them openly. But we will not allow intimidation, subtle or otherwise, to define this neighborhood." The press scribbled notes. Callahan realized something critical in that moment. Bumpy was not accusing him of the fire. He was placing him above it. Publicly. Offering him a path to dignity rather than conflict. To deny involvement was easy. Accept responsibility for community stability was harder, but strategic. Callahan measured the room. Journalists, ministers, investors, reading headlines later. He could not afford to appear petty. He cleared his throat. "My interests," he said carefully, "are business, not destruction. If misunderstandings have occurred, they will be corrected." There it was, not an admission, not an apology, But the escalation. After the meeting, supply delays eased. The aggressive accreditation review concluded favorably. The inspectors withdrew, and Callahan? He never admitted defeat, but he redirected his operations elsewhere, because Bumpy had done something unexpected. He had refused to fight on Callahan's terms. He had dragged the conflict into daylight, where ego becomes liability. That evening, Harlem gathered quietly outside the school again. Repairs had already begun on the minor fire damage. Mrs. Hayes approached, Bumpy with eyes that held both gratitude and awe. "You could have destroyed him," she said softly. Bumpy looked at the repaired brick. "Destruction creates vacancies." He replied, "Vacancies invite worse men." Children resumed playing in the courtyard, and Harlem understood something new. Strength was not loud. Power did not need spectacle. And the most dangerous man in the room is often the one who never raises his voice. But his knife fell. Bumpy stood alone for a moment, beneath the street lamp. Because he understood something else. Each confrontation raised his visibility. Each victory widened his shadow. And somewhere in the city, men who preferred chaos to competence were beginning to notice. Leadership, Bumpy had learned, was not measured by how many battles you survived. It was measured by how much of yourself you preserved while surviving them. By the winter of 1939, Harlem was no longer trembling under pressure. It had endured audits, supply blockades, insinuations, and fire. It had stood firm not because it was invincible, but because it refused to fracture. But the greater the stability, the more dangerous the silence around it became. Because men who build control through fear do not fear confrontation, they fear irrelevance. And Bumpy Johnson was becoming something far more threatening than a rival. He was becoming necessary. The final challenge did not arrive in smoke or inspections. It arrived in applause. Downtown Coalition announced a new initiative, a civic restoration partnership designed to modernize Harlem infrastructure. The proposal was polished, celebrated in newspapers, endorsed by city officials. It promised funding for schools, business grants, and expanded police presence to ensure order. On paper, it looked like progress. In reality, it was acquisition. The proposal included clauses transferring operational oversight of several Harlem institutions, including St. Nicholas Community School, to a centralized administrative board controlled by downtown interests. Ownership without visible takeover, influence without accountability. Control wrapped in generosity. The community gathered in uneasy confusion. Some saw opportunity, others sensed erosion. The funding was real, the improvements tangible, but the autonomy? Subtly disappearing. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes visited Bumpy again. Though this time her expression was not weary, it was torn. "They're offering us security," she said quietly. "Heating upgrades. Expanded curriculum. Salaries for teachers we can't currently afford. And in exchange?" Bumpy asked. She hesitated. "Board oversight." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Not removal. Not eviction. Absorption. This was smarter than Whitmore. More patient than Callahan. This was strategy refined. And this time, Harlem was divided. Some business owners argued that refusing the partnership would appear stubborn. Some parents, exhausted by months of uncertainty, welcomed the promise of stability. Even ministers debated whether pride should outweigh practicality. Bumpy did not immediately oppose the plan. He studied it. For days, clause by clause, footnote by footnote. He noticed something buried in the language. The board would reserve the right to approve curriculum changes. It could appoint administrative replacements. It could realign educational priorities to match broader city standards. In other words, colon control. Not today. But eventually. And once autonomy is surrendered quietly, reclaiming it requires noise. Bumpy called a community assembly at the school. The same hall where Whitmore had once stood. This time, the room was not unified. It was conflicted. Parents murmured anxiously. Shopkeepers debated under their breath. Journalists waited with sharpened pencils. When Bumpy stepped to the front, he did not raise his hands for silence. He waited. The room settled gradually. "I will not tell you what to choose," he began evenly. That alone surprised them. "This proposal offers comfort," he continued. "It offers insulation from future pressure." Heads nodded cautiously. "But comfort," he said softly, "is not the same as freedom." The room quieted further. "If we accept this partnership, we gain funding. We gain protection. But we also surrender something invisible, the right to decide who we are." A father stood up. "And if we refuse?" he asked. "What if pressure returns?" Bumpy met his gaze calmly. "Then we endure it together." Silenced out, he did not dramatize. He did not condemn the proposal outright. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He placed two documents on the table. The first was the downtown proposal. The second was a ledger, our own. He said he had spent weeks organizing a Harlem cooperative trust. Small investments pooled from businesses, churches, families. Not enough to match downtown funding immediately, but enough to begin. "If we choose autonomy," he said, "we must fund it ourselves." Murmurs rippled. "That will be difficult," someone whispered. "Yes," Bumpy agreed. "It will be slower. Yes, it will be uncertain. Yes," he paused, "but it will be ours." The turning point did not arrive with applause. It arrived with decision. Mrs. Hayes stood. "I would rather teach in a building we struggle to heat," she said firmly, "than in one where someone else decides what our children should become." The room shifted. One by one, parents stood. Shopkeepers pledged small percentages of profits. Ministers offered church funds. A barber in the back raised his hand and said, "I'll give $10 a week." It was not dramatic. It was steady. The vote was taken. The partnership was declined. Downtown newspapers reacted predictably. Headlines questioned Harlem's judgment. Editorials suggested the neighborhood had rejected progress. But something remarkable happened. The narrative did not fracture Harlem. It strengthened it. The cooperative trust began slowly replacing external supply chains. Local contractors repaired heating systems at reduced rates. Teachers volunteered extra hours. Community dinners were organized to raise funds, and children watched. They watched adults choose dignity over ease. They watched sacrifice replace dependency. Weeks passed. Downtown officials waited for collapse. It did not come. Instead, something unexpected occurred. The Civic Restoration Partnership quietly withdrew its oversight clause and resubmitted a revised proposal, offering funding without control. Because the original leverage had failed, Harlem had proven it could survive without absorption. The revised proposal included no operational oversight, no board appointments, no curriculum approval rights. Just partnership. This time, Bumpy did not reject it outright. He reviewed it publicly. "This," he said calmly, "at the next assembly, is cooperation, not control." The room approved. Funding arrived, but autonomy remained intact. The final victory was not loud. It was structural. Harlem had negotiated from strength, and downtown had adjusted. One evening, as winter settled softly over the brownstones, Mrs. Hayes approached Bumpy outside the school one final time. "You could have taken control," she said quietly. "You could have made yourself indispensable." Bumpy watched children laughing inside the warm-lit windows. "If they depend on me," he replied softly, "they weaken when I'm gone." She studied him. "And what do you want them to be?" "Independent." Across the street, a journalist who had once questioned Bumpy's influence approached hesitantly. "Mr. Johnson," he said, notebook in hand, "how would you describe your leadership?" Bumpy considered the question carefully. "I do not lead Harlem," he said finally. "I protect its ability to lead itself." The journalist lowered his pen slowly. because that was not the answer of a conqueror. It was the answer of a guardian. As the night deepened and street lamps cast long golden shadows, Bumpy remained on the stoop alone for a moment. He had refused eviction. He had refused intimidation. He had refused absorption. But most importantly, he had refused to burn. Many men in his position would have answered aggression with spectacle, would have answered pressure with fire, but Bumpy understood something timeless. Its fire spreads, stability builds. Harlem did not win because it destroyed its adversaries. It won because it outlasted them, because dignity, once organized, becomes immovable. And long after downtown investors rotated through new strategies and new partnerships, one truth remained etched quietly into Harlem's foundation: power without conscience collapses. Power with restraint endures. The children of St. Nicholas Community School would grow up not remembering the audits, the fires, or the proposals. They would remember warmth. In winter. They would remember teachers who stayed. They would remember adults who stood steady when surrender looked easier. And somewhere in the city's layered history, when people whispered the name Bumpy Johnson, it would not be with fear. It would be with recognition. Of a man who ruled, but of a man who refused to let others rule unjustly. And sometimes that is the most powerful story of all.